Hello and welcome to the Seattle Atheist Church. Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, free thinkers, questioning, and believers, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At the Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. And now on to our creed. Seattle Atheist Church was founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics, which commits us, on one hand, to reason and evidence-based thinking, and on the other, to compassion to our fellow human beings. These commitments motivate us to oppose magical and wishful thinking and all forms of dogma, as well as to stand firmly against all forms of oppression. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to other conscious beings. We believe in good because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds good to you, then you're probably in the right place.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very grateful. And also, this is my first sermon ever, in fact, and of course, the first sermon to an atheist church as well. So I'm very excited about this thing. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to share now the screen. I hope it will work. Can you all see this? It's working? Yeah. So the title here of my talk is Utilitarianism and Heavy Duties. So I'm going to present the theory, it's a normative moral theory, utilitarianism, and also one famous objection to this theory, namely that it gives us duties that are too heavy, that it's too demanding for us to follow this moral principle, utilitarianism. So first of all, I would like to just say a bit about, sorry, now it doesn't move, just there, okay. Some of the attractions of utilitarianism, why have people been attracted, or still are, of course. This is still quite a popular moral theory. It's been, of course, embraced by through the ages by economists, and still quite actually popular among economists. But it's also been, of course, embraced by people in various movements, for instance, anti-slave movements, and more recently, animal liberation movements. So famously, Peter Singer, a utilitarian, has been quite active in providing sort of moral argument against experimentation on animals, and also arguments for vegetarianism and veganism. But the sort of general attractions has to do with the following, I think, namely, which I think is a pretty nice slogan, make the world a better place, right? Who would deny that? Would we say that we should make it a worse place? No, we do agree, right, that we should make the world a better place. And the utilitarian will then add that we make the world better by making it better for humans and animals, not just humans, but also animals. So famously, as I said, utilitarianism has been invoked in the sort of liberation of animals. And then, importantly, when we make the world a better place, we need to be impartial and give well-being of everyone the same weight. So the only thing that matters is the degree of well-being. It doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter your class, your sex, gender, it doesn't matter your race or the species, right? So animals and humans, as I said, are treated equally. It's only the degree of well-being, how well off and badly off you are, that matters for utilitarians. Sorry, I'm just trying to, there you go. And another feature, which is also an attraction, I think, and a sort of a pro for this theory, is that it's universal. So the well-being of all individuals count, humans, animals, present and future, everywhere in the world, everywhere in the universe. So if there are actually aliens out there, their well-being should count too, and equally as humans and animals here on Earth. So Jeremy Bentham, one of the founders actually of utilitarianism, he's sitting there, you can see him, he's actually in a university college in London. And it's a bit gruesome to say, but actually he's stuffed up. Actually, he's a mummy sitting there, and he's wheeled out for special occasions in that college. And he wanted that himself. So that was actually part of his will, to be able to be present at these meetings, special meetings at the college. So there he is, not his real head, actually, it's a wax version of his head. So famously, Jeremy Bentham said that the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And he said this, as you can see, quite a long time ago, and it was pretty radical. He was against slavery, he was for homosexuality, that was perfectly fine, and he was for animal well-being, to actually we should treat animals much better, and he reformed prisons and as well, actually. So he was early with a lot of views that today are seen as sort of clear moral progress. At the time, of course, he got a lot of resistance and objections to these views, these radical views at the time, very radical. And the impartiality then, again, is that no individual animal or humans, that's actually Swedish, människa, human, should give them more weight than anyone else, as I said. And the only thing that counts is the degree of well-being, nothing else. Doesn't matter who you are and what group you belong to. Now, classical utilitarianism, there are different forms actually of utilitarianism, but classical utilitarianism can be broken down into a few elements. And it's good to actually do this kind of exercise, because then you can see what utilitarianism amounts to. And you can also, if you don't like it, think about which element of this theory you don't like, right? It might be that some of them are fine, but some elements you don't like. So this is a way to sort of decompose it and then see what it sort of contains. So the first really important part is so-called act consequentialism, which says that an act ought to be done just in case it has better consequences than any other alternative action. The second element here is that an action has better consequences than another, just in case its consequences contain more total well-being. And the total well-being, that's the third element, is the sum of everyone's well-being. So the idea is that you think about an outcome of an action, you look into the outcome, so to speak, and you look at the well-being of everyone, the degree of well-being of everyone in that outcome, and you sum up those degrees, and that will be the total well-being contained in that outcome. And of course, some of the well-being will be positive, some will be negative. So the idea is then you detract the negative from the positive well-being, and you get the total sum of well-being. This well-being is assumed, according to classical utilitarianism, to be subjective. So it involves mental states, sort of goings on in your mind. So famously, some utilitarians think that well-being has only to do with pleasure. Others think it has to do with preference, satisfaction. And the latter one view is, of course, quite common among economists who focuses on people's preferences and how they are revealed in the market. So these are the four sort of elements of classical utilitarianism. And today, actually, what I want to be focused on in the discussion of this objection, namely the heavy-duty objection, is actually going to be the first one, act consequentialism, that will be the target. Well, I hope you can see that there are some attractions here, actually, and it looks quite sort of plausible on the face of it, utilitarianism. As I said, who would deny that we should make the world a better place? And who would deny that we can make it better by making it better for humans and animals? But there are lots of objections to utilitarianism. And today, I only have time to discuss one, and that's too demanding, that the duties are too heavy. But there are many other objections, and some of them you can read about in the literature I'm going to list at the end of the talk. I'm here just listing a few other objections, that it is self-effacing. Using it can have very bad consequences. Sometimes then utilitarianism will tell you not to use it. So for instance, if you're standing in front of by the river and you see someone drowning and you start calculating on the possible consequence of saving this person, it might be too late when you finish your calculations to save the person. So then actually using the theory as a method of decision can actually be detrimental, have bad consequences. So that's another famous one I'm not going to discuss further. Another one is that it's too difficult to apply correctly. Why? Because you need to know what's going to happen in the future, right? The consequences. Do you know what will happen in the future? No, you don't, not in detail. So we lack relevant information then, and that means that we can't decide which consequences are going to be better than other consequences, and then we are stuck. Too permissive, and it allows actions that seem to be plainly wrong. It can actually then justify harming one person in order to give lots of benefits to other people, even if those benefits are tiny, because if there are sufficiently many people benefiting from harming one person, then these benefits will outweigh the harm done to one person. And again, that's of course not a very nice implication. So there's lots of discussion about these objections too. But today, as I said, I'm going to focus on the first one, being too demanding. So what is it then? What does it mean to say it's too demanding? Well, zero in here on the sort of so-called heroic acts. So an act that when you actually are, sacrificing perhaps your life or something really dear to you in order to help others. We can imagine the famous acts actually performed by heroes, right? As a sort of typical examples. So what does then the utilitarian say? Well, utilitarian says that a heroic act is not just permissible, but actually required, something you ought to do when it has the best consequences. So for instance, to give an example, if you can save your friends by throwing yourself on a hand grenade, and that's the only way to save your friends, then that's something you ought to do. Not just that it's desirable or a praiseworthy action, something you required, you ought to do. And that looks too demanding. Second example, assume that you can run into the burning building and save your neighbor. And it's quite a dangerous feat, and you might also get hurt by doing this. But assume that doing this will actually lead to the best consequences. You will be able to save the neighbor. Again, utilitarianism will say that you ought to run into the burning building and save your neighbor. And not just that it's praiseworthy and a good thing to do, you ought to, you're required to do this. And again, it looks like it's too demanding. Because what we would like to say, I guess, is that it's, as I said, desirable or a good thing or praiseworthy to do these things, but not required. It's something you do which is beyond the call of duty. And in philosophy, it's sometimes called supererogatory actions, things that are good, praiseworthy, desirable, but are beyond the call of duty. It doesn't seem to be in the room for that in utilitarianism. Well, there are some replies, of course, to this objection. So one reply is just to say, look, remember that ought implies can. Namely, if you ought to do something, you must be able to do it. And of course, in some situation, the heroic act is not something you can do because you might be completely paralyzed by fear. For instance, in front of this burning building, you might not be able to move. And of course, if you can't run into the building, then utilitarianism will not tell you that you ought to, because ought implies can. If you ought to do something, you must be able to do it. And sometimes you might not be able to do it because you're completely paralyzed by fear, for instance. So that, I think, is a reply that it's okay. I mean, it will work in some cases, of course, like the one I just described. But of course, there are other cases where it's possible to do the heroic act. It's just that it's very difficult and very painful, perhaps, and it takes lots of guts to do it. But it's not impossible. It's not like you're paralyzed by fear, but you can actually move, you can actually go into the burning building, but it's something you really wish you don't want to do, right? You really are very scared, but not paralyzed, but you can do it. You can actually overcome it, but it's difficult, very, very difficult. But again, in those cases, then utilitarianism will tell you, well, you can do it, and it maximizes the total value. You ought to do it then. That's what you're required to do. So this first reply is not a very satisfactory reply. It's not sort of dealing with all the issues, in fact, just some of them. The second reply is to distinguish between wrong on the one hand and ought to be blamed or blameworthy on the other. So quite often we sort of just replace the one with the other, right? So if you do something that's wrong, we say, well, person ought to be blamed. If someone does something that's wrong, well, the person is blameworthy. It seems to be something we just sort of take for granted. But perhaps we shouldn't. Perhaps that link is not that close, actually, between wrong on the one hand and ought to be blamed and blameworthy on the other. So, for instance, when you fail to act heroically because you're very afraid, it's not actually always true that you ought to be blamed, even though you acted wrongly. So the utilitarian can actually say, look, blaming you when you have failed to act heroically might just make the situation worse, make things worse. Why? Because blaming is an action. So if you perform the action and blame me because I didn't run into the burning building, I might feel very bad. And it's worse, I might feel bad already, actually, because I didn't do it. But I will feel even worse if you blame me. And that means that it's not an action that you ought to perform towards me, because it's not actually having good consequences, having bad consequences. So I can actually act wrongly. I didn't run into the burning building, but it's not true that you ought to blame me for that, because blaming me will just make things worse. Similarly, or relatedly, I might actually have a good excuse, because perhaps I was almost paralyzed by fear. That's why I didn't run into the building. I just was almost paralyzed. It really would take me a lot of energy and willpower to overcome my fear. I could have done it, but it would have been very, very, very difficult. In those cases, you might think I have a quite good excuse for not doing what I ought to do. And if I have a good excuse, I might not be blameworthy, or perhaps a little bit blameworthy, but not much blameworthy, because I have this good excuse for not doing what I ought to do. So this reply is then sort of making clear, or really stressing, that there is this distinction between, on the one hand, wrong, and on the other hand, ought to be blamed and blameworthy. They're not the same kind of concepts. A third reply, because you might perhaps think that still, it's not happy with this second reply, because it's still true that perhaps I am in cases where it wouldn't be so difficult for me to run into the burning building, or so difficult for me to just jump over the hand grenade. I mean, I just need to jump. Still, you might think that, am I really required to do these things? Isn't it just something that would be praiseworthy, or something good or desirable? To say that I'm required or have the duty to do it or must do it seem to be a bit too demanding again. So that's still the issue, right? That there seem to be, the utilitarian is just having these very demanding requirements. And the third reply is actually then saying, look, wait a minute, you're assuming that ought means duty or must or requirement, but it doesn't have to. It's true that utilitarianism says that you ought to maximize value. Sure, that's the definition, right? But there are actually two meanings of ought. There's a stronger meaning, means must, duty, required, and there's a weaker meaning, namely highly recommendable, but not required, not a duty, or not something you must do. And to give you an example, you ought to call your mother tonight, but you don't have to do it. It's a phrase we can, I'm sure you might have heard yourself, actually. And that seemed to suggest that there's an ought here. You ought to call your mother, but it's not required. It's not your duty. And it's nothing you must do, but it's something that's highly recommendable. Your mother would really appreciate a call tonight, but it's not like it's a very important discussion you need to do, not that you need to help her with something, or that you haven't talked to her for months and months. It's not that, but it's just would be a nice thing, right, for your mother to hear your voice, and that might be very highly recommendable then to do it, but not required. You don't have to do it. So we then seem to have a distinction between ought and having to do it, or being required to do it. And utilitarianism can make use of that weaker notion, right? And if utilitarianism is defined in terms of this weaker meaning of ought, it does no longer tell us that we must perform heroic acts, only that they are highly recommendable. Not that they're required, not that they're your duty or you must do it, just that they are highly recommendable. They are on the top of the recommendable actions, in fact, right? So that's a move you can make, and that's quite a radical reply, right? Because that will actually take the sting out of the objection completely, because sure, you ought to maximize value. I'm not saying you're required to do it, but I'm just saying it's highly recommendable that you do it. The highest recommendable action, so to speak. But then, of course, there's still a lingering worry here. Isn't there anything you must do according to utilitarianism? Actually, some utilitarians says no. It's just a theory about what's recommendable, and it's theory, perhaps you can phrase it in terms of reasons. It's just a theory about having more or less reasons to do things, and you have most reason to maximize total value. But it doesn't say anything about requirements or duties or must. That is a quite radical departure, though, from common sense morality, because we do talk about requirements and demands and must and duties in ordinary morality, right? So if the utilitarian will want to sort of not break with common sense morality here, they have to then find some cut-off point between the permissible and the impermissible. It's not easy, though, to do that. And there are some accounts out there, but I'm not going to get into them. But there's a challenge, at least for the utilitarian here, to find a cutoff point between the permissible and impermissible. And of course, the cutoff point cannot be between the highest recommendable action and then that one below, because then you're back to the problem. Has to be leeway on the top there, that you sort of you can do things that are beyond the call of duty. There's some recommendable actions. So there's a challenge still left here. Finally, then, when it comes to your life projects, then what does utilitarianism tell you then? Well, seem to suggest that you should actually give up or sacrifice lots of your own projects if they conflict with the aim of maximizing value. Because utilitarians will tell you to care a lot about others, right? Lots about helping others and less about yourself and your own projects, or artistic projects or intellectual projects or what have you. It will tell you to care much more about other people and their well-being, especially people that are really suffering. So are we then comfortable with saying that even if you're not required to sacrifice your own projects, is it really highly recommendable, using the weaker term here, a weaker notion of ought, highly recommendable to sacrifice your projects? Here, I think the reply is, or quite often is, that utilitarianism can actually be one of your main life projects. So even if you find it difficult now to help others because you are invested in your life projects that are perhaps quite sort of self-centered to some extent, you can change that. You're not sort of stuck with that. You can change your life projects so there are more other regarding. And in fact, if you then come together with others and engage in charity work, for instance, you will then change your attitudes towards this. You will actually come to find it interesting and actually not challenging. And in fact, you're not sacrificing your main life project, because utilitarianism itself is now your main life project. So this is sort of a pretty standard reply by the utilitarians. Of course, there are utilitarians out there that are living according to this sort of principle and this kind of sort of verdict. And in fact, they themselves say that, look, when I've started to work with others to help others, my life seems to be much more meaningful. I didn't see it before. I was much more invested in my own sort of projects, but now having this other regarding projects, I feel like I'm really breaking through and I'm sort of having a more meaningful life. I'm happier, in fact. So that needn't be then a life full of sacrifices. It can actually be a life that has more meaning, or at least so say these utilitarians that are active in various movements like effective altruism, for instance. So that's it for today. I'm very excited about discussing this with you. I'm just going to end with some reading suggestions. So there's my own book, which was mentioned in the beginning, Utilitarianism, a Guide for the Perplexed, which I do discuss these things in a bit more detail, and also discuss the other objections I listed in the beginning. There's a very nice book by De Lazare Radek and Peter Singer, Utilitarianism, a very short introduction. So if you want a very short introduction, that's the one to start with, in fact. And then there's a new, actually, web resource with the articles and guest essays. It's run by William MacAskill, one of the founders of Effective Altruism, and Richard Yetter Chappell and Darius Meissner. And here you can find lots of information about utilitarianism, history, applications, and, as I said, specially invited guest essays on various different topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Krister. Let's all unmute ourselves for a moment and give Krister a round of applause. Woo! Woo, thank you so much.